Chapter 21, Section 4. Wets and Dries Clash Over Prohibition. On February 14, 1929, men dressed in police uniforms raided the headquarters of Chicago's Moran Gang. When the officers ordered the gangsters to raise their hands and lined up against the wall, the gang members thought nothing of it. The police were always annoying them. These police officers, however, were members of Al Scarface Capone's rival gang in disguise. Capone's men whipped out their guns and blasted away. 7 members of the Moran Gang died in what soon became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This bloodbath was one of the many unexpected consequences of what Herbert Hoover called an experiment noble in purpose: prohibition. The dry perspective: prohibition improved society. Traditionalists and progressive reformers saw passage of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transport of alcoholic beverages, as a great victory. They pointed to evidence that alcoholism caused crime, violence, and the breakup of families. Dries, as backers of prohibition were known, believed that stopping society from drinking would result in a healthier, happier society. Dries also saw prohibition as a way of taming city life. Support for prohibition centered mainly in rural areas, and many Dries saw the 18th Amendment as a triumph of rural over urban Americans. As one Dry put it, prohibition allowed the pure stream of the country sentiment and township morals to flush out to the cesspools of cities. In addition, many traditionalists were suspicious of foreigners. They associated beer drinking with immigrants of German descent and wine drinking with Italian immigrants. To them, prohibition was a way to curb such foreign influences. At first, prohibition seemed to the Dries to deliver its expected benefits. The national consumption of alcohol did decline, from an annual average of 2.6 gallons per capita before the war to less than a gallon by the 1930s. Fewer workers spent their wages at saloons, to the benefit of the families. The greatest decline in drinking probably occurred in the groups that resented prohibition the most: poor and working-class ethnic groups. In their view, prohibition was just another example of nativist prejudice toward immigrants. The wet perspective: prohibition restricts freedom and breeds crime. Opponents of prohibition, called wets, were small in number at first, but as the law went into effect, their numbers grew. Opposition centered mainly in large cities and immigrant communities. Many modernists attacked prohibition as an attempt by the federal government to legislate morality. Journalist H.L. Mencken, a champion of modernism, called Dries ignorant bumpkins of the cow states who resented the fact that they had to swill raw corn liquor while city slickers got good wine and whiskey. Another modernist, Massachusetts Senator David Walsh, rejected traditionalist arguments that drinking was sinful. He reminded Dries that the first miracle performed by Jesus had been to turn water into wine. Were Jesus to perform this miracle in Prohibition-era America, Walsh observed, he would be jailed and possibly crucified again. Prohibition seemed doomed from the start. In October 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment. But the federal government never gave the enforcement agency, called the Prohibition Bureau, sufficient personnel, money, or supplies. The Bureau's agents were simply outnumbered by the millions of Americans who wanted to drink. Hoover later estimated that the government would need 250,000 agents to make prohibition work. As a result, prohibition led to an increase in illegal behavior by normally law-abiding citizens. Millions of Americans simply refused to abstain from drinking. Some learned how to brew their own bathtub gin. Others bought bootleg alcohol that was distilled illegally and smuggled into the United States from Canada. As thousands of bars and pubs were forced to close, they were replaced by nearly twice as many secret drinking clubs called speakeasies. The term speakeasy came from the practice of speaking quietly about illegal saloons so as not to alert police. A 1929 issue of New York City's Variety boldly reported 5 out of every 7 cigar stores, lunchrooms, and beauty parlors are speaks selling gin. The number of speakeasies in New York City alone was estimated at 32,000. The widespread availability of illegal alcohol led the humorist Will Rogers to quip, "Prohibition is better than no liquor at all." The growing demand for liquor created a golden opportunity for crooks like Al Capone. Bootlegging, the production, transport, and sale of illegal alcohol, was a multi-billion-dollar business by the mid-1920s. Chicago bootlegger Capone exhibited his wealth by driving around in a $30,000 Cadillac while flashing an 11.5-carat diamond ring. To keep his profits flowing without government interference, he bribed politicians, judges, and police officers. He also eliminated rival bootleggers. His 1,000-member gang was blamed for hundreds of murders. In 1931, Capone finally went to jail, not for bootlegging or murder, but for tax evasion. As lawlessness, violence, and corruption increased, support for prohibition dwindled. By the late 1920s, many Americans believed that prohibition had caused more harm than good. In 1933, the states ratified the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition.